Actually, lately I've been trying to get the bulletin out on Monday so that my friends can make sure that I have things right before I print it. This week was a busy week for me at work and at home, and so I wasn't over at the office where the printer is, except for the day that I printed to put the bulletin together. So, I apologize, Shirley, because normally I don't go back and forth with you. You're right, most of the time. But Suzanne had sent me a message saying, you got the wrong number in there. And I wrote back and I said, I got the wrong name in there, and I don't have time to change it. So.
I didn't find it, Jim found it.
Thank you, Jim. I still appreciate it. I don't care. No, actually, I do care. But I don't care which one you found it. I appreciate it. Keep me straight, okay? Just this time, I had the wrong name and I couldn't change it. Normally, I would have. In our Bibles, we are still in Exodus. We're going to be in Exodus through the 31st, except that on the 31st, we will also be in Matthew. Exodus and Matthew. But we are looking at the reasons that the Passover are important. Where's my or my English teachers, did I use the right phraseology? The reasons that the Passover are important, okay? I keep my English teachers busy too. So last week we left the Israelites on the other side of the Red Sea. You know, not the side they started out on the other side. And the waters had closed, and they had had their boundary experience. They knew that there was no turning back. Once the waters close, the only direction that you can move is forward. Towards the promised land. There's a problem. Superhighways haven't been built yet. No airports. No railroads. Only wilderness. Now they did have some animals with them, but as I pointed out last week, the number of Israelites that were crossing are really too big for us to even imagine. I mean, many of us have been to stadiums where you've seen these huge crowds. Well, probably more than all the stadiums on this side on this coast. A lot of people. And then there's Moses, who leads them out into the middle of the desert. And there's no food. And there's no water. And what water there is bitter. Put yourself in that position. Your favorite restaurant isn't there either. See, that's hard for us to imagine. It's hard for us to imagine being out in the middle of a desert where there is nothing. A little over 30, maybe 35 years ago, some friends of mine and I decided that we were going to go to a conference the long way. And we went from Edgerton, Wisconsin, across the northern side up to Washington and Oregon, and we were going to, I'm sorry, my sister would have killed me for that one, Oregon, and we were going to drive down the west coast to Riverside, California, and then they were going to go home with their parents, and I was going to drive back to Indiana. And we decided that our favorite thing for breakfast were Egg McMuffins. And we could not live without our Egg McMuffins every morning. And then we got to Washington State. Every town in Washington State does not have McDonald's. I don't know if they do today, because there's a McDonald's down the road 10 miles south of White Cloud now, which there wasn't when I lived in White Cloud, Michigan. There is one now. So they may have gotten our message and built some McDonald's out there, but there were no McDonald's for 3 days. 3 days without our McMuffins. I only say that to get you and I, think about it. You're taking a trip. You're out in the middle of a desert. If you know with Washington and Oregon, you know that it's not a desert. It's lush and it's green and it's wet. But no McDonald's up there. Back then. There's no food. And the water is bitter. And the people complain and they quarrel with Moses. And they carry on, and the congregation builds a tent of meeting. They furnish the tent of meeting, and Moses goes up to get the laws And the people build their calf. And the people murmur. Or in the King James, I think it's complain. Grudge. This is the neutral zone. They've had their great experience getting away from Pharaoh with the plagues and all of the things that came about, and they got away. The Passover sacrifices was presented so that the Israelites had been spared. They've escaped their bitter treatment. They've had their boundary experience when they get to the other side, and they don't have to run anymore. But they didn't think about the desert, the walk, the long walk. And they find water, but the water's bitter. So they complain about the water. They let's read this for a few minutes. Let's go to Exodus chapter 15 and look at beginning in verse 22. I'm going to read down through 16:2. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness, 3 days, without McDonald's, 3 days. They went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because they were bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. So the people grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And then he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. And he threw it into the water, and the waters became sweet. And there he made for them a statute, a regulation. And he tested them. And he said, "If you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptian, for I, the Lord, am your healer." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the waters. And then they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. And on the 15th day of the second month after their departure from the land of Egypt, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron because it was wilderness. You ever been there? Not in the wilderness, not out here. But have you ever been in a wilderness? A wilderness of the mind, perhaps, where you're out there and God has given you blessings, and you've seen the power of God, and you've seen the wisdom of God, and yet you can't experience the wisdom of God because you expect the wisdom of God. And so you grumble. You complain. God, you've done all of these things for me, and yet here I am out here in this wilderness, and I can't feel your presence. They think they're just moving on, and what else can happen? You know, they were out there for 15 days. How far can you get in 15 days? Now, last summer in 15 days I got from the East Coast to the West Coast. Spent 8 days on the West Coast and it started back for the East Coast again. 15 days. How far can you get in 15 days? But they have thousands of miles to walk, and they complain, and they grumble, and they quarrel about everything. Because it's a neutral zone. They have expectations, and their expectations are not being met. Why the murmuring in the neutral zone? Because there's too much uncertainty. There's too much fear. The word for grumbling in the Hebrew is equal to obstinance. A complaining, a constant complaining, especially in word. Murmuring and grudging and striving and contending and quarreling and carrying on because you can't get anywhere else. In 17:7, Moses calls this the place where they are after those 15 days, he calls it Massah. Because Massah is a place of despair. It's a place of trial. It's a place of testing. It's a place of quarrelsome temptation because of what the people are expecting. Now we see healing all around us. We see the grace of God all around us. We see the love of God all around us. But we don't always see Him where we expect to see Him. In our lives right now, not even right here, but in our lives right now, we see shootings, and we see violence, and we see terror against our families and against our children, and we wonder, where is God? And we don't look for the miracles that are there. Because the other things pop up. Keep coming back. We feel that we've been cut off from God. And we feel bad. And God is right there with us the whole time. He's not absent from our lives. But we can't always hear Him. Because we're expecting what we have seen before. The miracle of the plagues. But they didn't bother us. The miracle of the crossing. But the Egyptians didn't get there. The miracle of the water, which we had just seen. He threw a tree into the water and it became sweet. The miracle of the manna that came down from heaven. They had their food. They didn't have to grow it. They didn't have to hunt it. They didn't have to figure out what was edible and what wasn't edible because God gave it to them. And yet they complained. We're not like that. Not like that at all. So the question that you have to ask is, are we in the neutral zone? We try to make our own way. We look to false gods for guidance. You know, if you move all the way back, I think it's chapter 34 in Exodus. Yeah, chapter 34 in Exodus. Moses had gone up on the mountain to be with God. He had gone up there to spend time. And God had given him, I'm sorry, not 34, it's 32. God had given him tablets to bring down with rules. And we think sometimes that these rules are obsessive and difficult to deal with, and we don't want them around. And so we try to make our own way, and so did they. Moses had been up on the mountain for so long that they thought that the Israelites thought something had happened. And they didn't want to be left out in the middle of the wilderness with nothing. So they decided to make their own God. Even though they knew that God had carried them through the plagues. God had carried them across the Red Sea. God had deposited them on the other side. He had given them food. He had been with them. Why would God take you out in the middle of the wilderness and drop you there and take away your leader and give you nothing? That's the question we don't ask. That's the question the Israelites didn't ask. Instead, they went to Aaron and they said, we need something to lead us. And Aaron says, okay, bring me all your gold earrings and I will melt them down. And suddenly this calf just arose out of the fire. Do you believe that? We try to make our own way. We look to false gods for guidance. And then when our leader comes down, we don't understand why he threw those tablets down and broke them. We find fault with the way that the church is moving. We find fault with the way that everything else is going on. We find fault with each other because we can't figure out where is God in all of this. And so then we bring the gold and we throw it down into the fire and expect a calf to come up and lead us. Anybody here ever been led by a golden calf? I didn't mean following one, I meant led by one. Okay. Usually golden calves don't lead you anywhere because they are stable unless you put wheels under them and push them. My golden calf for years has been automobiles. I love my cars. Ask my kids. Ask my wife. I love my cars. They've always been my golden calf. But you know what happens with my cars? They break down. When I don't want them to break down. But yet, that's what we look for. That's what we put our faith in. Here's the thing. Here's the thing that comes out of all of that. What happened to the tablets after they got broken? Who stepped in and took care of the problem? Now, I used to have, most of you know what I think of Texas. I'm not a big Texas fan. But I had this really cool granite Texas shape. Great thing. And I wanted to lay it out in the backyard as a stepping stone or something. And before it got out in the backyard, somebody, probably me, but somebody dropped it in the garage and the top of Texas broke off. You know, up there where Amarillo is. It broke off. And then I looked at it. So, you know, I know what it is to try to put granite on granite and make it stay. It doesn't work. There is no granite glue. There is no granite glue. There is cement, but then you have this little river running through Amarillo that doesn't exist. Or something. There is no glue. There is no glue for the tablets that Moses brought down. So God had to pick up the pieces and put them back together and re-etch the stone and give it back to them again. God picks up the pieces so that we can move on. He shares His loving kindness, His graciousness, His compassion, all of these words that we like to put into the New Testament. If you look over at this is where chapter 34 comes into this. If you look over at Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, and you'll see the words. Loving kindness. The Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Wait, He didn't forgive sin in the Old Testament, did He? Oh, and sin, and yet He will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, the grandchildren, all, and etc. But God made haste to bow low to the earth. Moses made haste to bow low to the earth and worship. And he said, if now I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, I pray, let the Lord go along in our midst, even though the people are obstinate. And do pardon us for our iniquity and our sin, and take us as your own possession. We may be in the neutral zone, but that's where you're also going to find the loving kindness, the grace, the love, and the power of God through Jesus Christ. How far into the neutral zone do we go? Stand together and sing number 170, One Day. 170 is our closing hymn. Let's stand together.
So now the God of peace, who brought up from the dead the great shepherd of the sheep, through the blood of the covenant, even Jesus our Lord, equip you in every good thing to do his will, working in us that which is pleasing in his sight, through Jesus Christ, to whom be the glory forever and ever. Amen.